A simple woman came to an elite library just to read a book, but because she was poorly dressed and didn't look like everyone else, they refused to give her anything. She was humiliated by both the staff and the guests, who laughed at her and filmed her mockingly. But the next day, they deeply regretted it, because she returned, not alone, but with her billionaire son, who owned the library and the entire shopping mall. And she wasn't just a simple woman, she was a world-famous author. What she did next shocked everyone. Margaret paused just inside the door, smoothing her coat. She wasn't used to this kind of space. But she wasn't afraid of it either. Not yet. She approached the reception desk. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I'm here to access the archives. I believe your library holds a first edition of A Grace of Light by Delilah Quinn." The receptionist, a young man with slicked back blonde hair and a nameplate that read Devin, looked up with a tight-lipped smile. His eyes moved over her like a TSA scan. "You'll need a members-only keycard for that section," he said, tapping the counter as if it were a bell. "And we don't grant day passes." Margaret reached into her tote. "I'm not here on a whim. I sent an email last month, was told the archives were open for public literary research on Wednesdays." Devin didn't check the computer. "Public means alumni or special invitees." He leaned forward, his voice honeyed with condescension. "This isn't the public library downtown, ma'am." The word ma'am cut sharper than he meant it to. The nearby patrons, 3 in tailored coats, sipping espresso, another browsing rare volumes, looked over at the exchange. One of them, a woman with oversized sunglasses and an Hermes scarf, whispered something that caused her companion to smirk. "Does she think this is a reading room for volunteers?" The woman laughed. Margaret's ears burned. "I just want to read," she said. But her voice was barely audible now. "I'm not hurting anyone." Devin shrugged. "We have policies, ma'am. It's best if you leave before I have to call security." The word security echoed. A chuckle rippled across the lounge, like a cough passed from one throat to the next. A man near the fireplace lifted his phone, as if capturing a scene worth retelling later at brunch. Margaret turned to go, tote tight against her chest, humiliation thick in her throat. At the door, she glanced back, not for them, but for herself. To remember the room. To remember how it felt to be dismissed. She would return. But not alone. Not looking like this. Not without letting them know exactly who she was. And the next morning she did. In a car that made the valet stand up straighter. Dressed in a fitted ivory coat with buttons like pearls and leather gloves that whispered power when she moved. The necklace around her throat was subtle but unmistakable. Vintage Cartier, a gift from someone who could buy the entire building if he wanted. And beside her walked her son, Jonathan Hale, whose name was engraved not only on the plaque outside the library, but on the deed of half the shopping plaza it belonged to. The billionaire tech investor. The prodigy turned philanthropist. And the owner, Devin would soon find out, of this entire block. What none of them knew, what would make jaws drop and whispers bloom like wildfire, was that the books they had denied her access to? She had written 3 of them herself. Including A Grace of Light, under a pen name they'd all admired for years. But she wouldn't start with that. She would start by watching them squirm. Margaret's heels clicked softly on the marble floor, a different sound from yesterday's shuffle of rubber soles. This morning, she moved with the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly where she was, and what she was owed. She didn't have to say a word. It was in the cut of her coat, the calm in her expression, the man walking beside her. Jonathan Hale. He wasn't just famous, he was known. 38, with the kind of composed brilliance that made billionaires and senators take his calls before their own mothers. He wore no tie, just a charcoal wool coat over a navy turtleneck, but he radiated presence. Every head in the library's grand room turned. Someone dropped a pen. The man by the fireplace, yes, the one who'd laughed at Margaret the day before, sat straighter, confusion knitting his brow. Devin, the receptionist, stood frozen behind the walnut desk, eyes flicking between mother and son like a deer between headlights. Jonathan gave him a brief nod. "Good morning." Is Director Albridge in? Devon blinked. She's. I believe she's in her office, Mr. Hale. Great. Jonathan turned to Margaret. Would you like to take a look around while I speak to her? Yes, she said, her voice low but clear. There's something I'd like to read. She walked past Devon without another glance, the click of her heels no longer apologetic. One of the espresso-sipping women nearly choked on her drink. The girl in the Hermes scarf was now scrolling her phone in disbelief, trying to confirm if that was the Jonathan Hale. And if so, who was that woman with him? At the far wall, Margaret stopped before the glass case where the rare first editions were displayed. There it was. A Grace of Light by D. Quinn. Delilah Quinn was a recluse, the kind whose face had never appeared at readings or signings. The kind readers speculated about endlessly online. Was she an elderly professor? A group of writers? A ghost? Margaret stared at the golden boss spine for a long moment. Then, without a word, she reached into her handbag and pulled out a worn paperback version. Same title. Her name, her story. She held it in her hand like a stone before skipping it across still waters. A woman approached. Margaret recognized her. The same one who'd made the volunteer joke yesterday. I'm sorry, the woman said, trying for casual. But I couldn't help noticing. You're with Mr. Hale? Margaret turned. He's my son. The woman's eyes widened. Oh my. Of course. Well, you look so different from yesterday. Yes. Margaret nodded. I wore what I had. A silence bloomed between them, uneasy and raw. The woman shifted her weight, searching for a polite escape, but Margaret wasn't finished. You know what's funny? She said, her voice soft. That book you're all so proud to showcase. I wrote it. The woman's breath caught. I'm sorry, what? D. Quinn. That's me. Margaret Quinn Hale, actually. I just never liked the spotlight. The nearby librarian, who'd been pretending not to eavesdrop, gasped audibly. Someone dropped a notebook. A group of interns by the archival desk froze mid-conversation. The woman in the scarf opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. But no one ever knew who she was, she whispered. Exactly, Margaret said. Which is why yesterday, I came here to sit and read in peace. And instead, I was humiliated. Devon approached now, his face pale. Mrs. Hale, Miss Quinn, I had no idea, ma'am. If I'd known. That I was worth respecting? His lips parted. No, I'm so sorry. Margaret looked at him, then past him, to the polished room that had yesterday treated her like refuse. It's not just you. It's the whole idea. That worth can be measured by a coat. Or a last name. Behind her, Jonathan stepped forward. Mother. She turned. He held up his phone. The board's been notified. And by the way, I've purchased controlling interest in the Crestwick Plaza this morning. Effective immediately, there will be policy changes regarding public access. Gasps fluttered across the floor like startled birds. Margaret turned to Devon. You can show me to the archives now. His voice caught in his throat. Of course. Right away. But before she followed him, Margaret looked at the gathering crowd. They were staring now, not in laughter, but in stunned silence. She met their gaze, not bitter, not smug. Just quiet. I never wanted to be the lesson, she said. But maybe some of you needed one. And with that, she walked toward the archives, where her own name was shelved unread. The air in the archives smelled of old leather, dust, and forgotten reverence. Margaret moved slowly, fingertips grazing the spines of books that lined the oak shelves, first editions, out-of-print volumes, annotated manuscripts preserved behind glass. But it wasn't the books that felt weighty now. It was the silence. Not the stunned silence of a humiliated crowd, but a deeper one. The kind earned by outlasting the noise. Behind her, Devon trailed like a shadow, each step less certain than the last. Is there anything else I can get you, ma'am? Tea? A research assistant? Margaret didn't look at him. No. Thank you? He hesitated. I read A Grace of Light in college, he said, voice sheepish. It helped me through my father's death. Margaret finally turned. Then I'm glad it found you. He nodded, throat tight, and slipped out quietly. Alone now, Margaret pulled out her notebook and sat at the long wooden table. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply opened to a blank page and began to write. Not a novel. Not yet. Just the truth, in her own hand, for no one else. Her thoughts wandered to yesterday. To the laughter. The stares. The moment she was made to feel like dust in a place built for diamonds. But what they hadn't known, what none of them had bothered to ask, was that she'd written their favorite stories under a borrowed name while sitting in second-hand chairs, drinking dollar coffee. She changed lives without ever being seen. They judged her by her coat. But she had stitched her worth into the world with words. A soft knock broke her reverie. She turned. Jonathan stood there alone now, no entourage, just her boy, grown, brilliant, but still her boy. I had them move your books out here, he said gently. Your section. With your name. Margaret blinked. Thought it was time the world read you clearly. She smiled, but behind her calm, something cracked, something old and tired finally released. And for the first time in a very long time, Margaret Hale allowed herself to be seen. Margaret followed Jonathan through the softly lit corridor that led to the East Wing, a space normally reserved for named donors and literary icons long dead. But today, a brass plaque had been added beside the tall oak doorway. Margaret Hale, D. Quinn Collection. Author. Archivist of Empathy. Witness to Quiet Lives. She stared at it, unmoving. Jonathan didn't speak. He just waited, hands tucked in his coat pockets like he used to do as a boy when he'd said something too big for his age. She stepped inside. It wasn't grand, not in the traditional sense. Just a quiet room with 2 leather chairs, a writing desk, and 4 mahogany shelves stacked with her own books, translated into a dozen languages. Some were battered paperbacks with cracked spines, others pristine hardcovers donated by collectors. On the wall hung framed letters, fan mail from readers, carefully preserved, none of which she'd ever seen. Margaret walked to the first shelf and picked up A Grace of Light. A German edition. She opened the front flap. There, in careful penmanship, was a note. To Frau Quinn, your book made my mother cry for the first time in 20 years. I think that's how I knew she was still alive inside. Thank you. Lucas, aged 19. Margaret sat slowly in the nearest chair, the book still open in her lap. Why now? She asked quietly. Why go through all this? Jonathan crouched beside her, no trace of the billionaire today, just her son. Because yesterday, I watched my mother be treated like she didn't matter. And I realized I'd let the world forget who you are. You didn't let them. He met her eyes. I didn't stop them. Margaret touched his cheek, fingers trembling. You stopped them today. There was a knock at the doorframe. Devon again, pale and uncertain. Mrs. Hale. People are asking. The board is asking. Would you consider doing a reading? Of A Grace of Light? For the patrons. They say they never knew, and that they want to. Margaret looked up, her eyes steady. She considered it. Then she smiled. Let them come. The chairs filled quickly. Crestwick Library's elite patrons, those who had once scoffed, whispered, and turned their backs, now sat shoulder to shoulder in awkward, overdressed silence, clutching copies of A Grace of Light like golden tickets. Even the scarf-wrapped woman from 2 days ago had returned, her sunglasses now tucked respectfully into her bag. There was no espresso today. No curated playlists humming from the intercom. Just a hum of discomfort and curiosity. Margaret stood at the lectern, a small book in her hands. She looked different now, but not just in clothes. Something had shifted in her shoulders, in her gaze. She didn't appear younger or richer or grander. She simply looked right. Like a person finally in alignment with the room they belonged to. She cleared her throat. The microphone wasn't necessary. When she spoke, the room leaned forward. I wrote A Grace of Light over the course of 8 years. Mostly at night. Sometimes in waiting rooms. Once in a laundromat, during a winter so cold my pen froze between sentences. A few people laughed weakly. Not because it was funny. Because it was true. I chose a pen name not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want people to read my stories thinking of me. I wanted them to see themselves. Her eyes swept the room. Ordinary people. The ones who get passed by. There was a long pause. Yesterday, she said softly, I came here in a coat I've had since my husband died. I was told I didn't belong. That I should leave before someone had to remove me. Today, I wear silk, and suddenly I'm worth listening to. Silence. Margaret opened her book. Her voice, when she read, was neither dramatic nor theatrical. It was honest. She read about a mother who fixed lawnmowers to keep her children fed. About a girl who sold stories at bus stops. About a librarian who never once felt brave until a stranger asked for her favorite book. When she looked up, many eyes were red. A man in a Brioni suit stood. Mrs. Hale, he said, voice cracking. I didn't recognize you before. But I knew your words. Margaret gave a faint nod. That's because they were never mine alone. And then something unexpected happened. One by one, the audience stood. Not in performative applause. In apology. In reverence. In recognition of what they almost missed. A quiet woman in old clothes had walked into their sanctuary of status, and reminded them of the value of the human heart. Margaret stayed at the lectern long after the applause faded. She didn't bask in it, she endured it, like a tide rolling in that she had waited years to see coming. When the last person sat down again, she closed the book with a soft thud that echoed louder than any voice. I wasn't going to come back today, she said, looking not at the wealthy patrons, but at the young intern in the back, the janitor in the hallway, the shy woman hugging a clipboard to her chest. I'd gone home yesterday and told myself I was too old to be humiliated. That I didn't owe this place, or anyone here, another breath. But then, she paused. Her throat tightened, not from weakness, but from memory. I thought about a girl I once saw at a bookstore. Maybe 12 years old. Clothes too big, hands too small. She didn't buy a book, just stood there, reading in the aisle until closing. She looked up at me when I passed and asked, Are any of these stories about people like us? Margaret looked down for a moment. I wrote A Grace of Light for her. She turned a page, then closed the book for good this time. This isn't just a story about a woman walking into a library. It's about who you don't see. Who you choose not to see. Who you laugh at until they remind you they were never beneath you. Just invisible. The woman with the Hermes scarf rose, her hands trembling. She began, her voice cracking. I'm sorry. Margaret nodded. Not forgiveness, not dismissal. Just acknowledgement. Jonathan, who had stayed back, now walked forward and spoke for the first time since the reading began. My mother never wanted the spotlight. But you all built a fortress around one and laughed when she didn't come dressed for it. He looked at Devon, who flinched. I'm not here to threaten anyone, Jonathan said. But I am here to say that this library, and everything attached to it, will reflect the values of the stories you've spent years praising. Murmurs stirred like wine through tall grass. Margaret looked at her son, then at the stunned crowd. No more velvet ropes around literature, she said. No more guards at the doors of wonder. She turned and walked out, not as the shamed woman of yesterday, but as the author whose story had finally been heard. The reading ended at noon, but no one really left. They lingered. In the foyer, in the garden courtyard, in the narrow rows of nonfiction. Like their shoes were heavier now, as if every step they took in that building carried the weight of what they'd done, or failed to do. Behind the reception desk, Devon sat rigid, staring at his reflection in the glass countertop. He remembered the way he'd said, "Ma'am," with that sharp, clipped finality, the way you tell someone they're in the wrong room. He remembered the way she clutched her tote like a shield. "I didn't know," he murmured. "Didn't want to," said the intern beside him, a soft-voiced girl named Callie. "None of us did. That's the point." By the fireplace, two of the espresso drinkers, stockbrokers, or maybe consultants, were arguing in hushed voices. "She was wearing a moth-eaten coat, Ron. And we mocked her for it. Like kids. Like actual children. And she turns out to be the writer whose words made my mother cry for the first time in a decade." Ron rubbed his face. "I mean, what the hell does that make us?" Across the atrium, the woman in the Hermes scarf, Evelyn, her name was, stood alone by the shelves. She had picked up a copy of The Garden of Bare Things, another D. Quinn novel, the one with the old man and the runaway girl who never speaks. Evelyn had underlined that book in college. Had cried on a bus in Prague reading Chapter 7. And yesterday, she'd laughed when the author walked into the room. She closed the book, held it to her chest, and whispered, "I'm sorry." But Margaret wasn't there to hear it. She and Jonathan had already stepped into the sunlit plaza, where the morning fog had lifted and the world looked, for once, honest. They sat on a bench just outside the library entrance, her tote resting by her feet. "I still don't want to be a symbol," Margaret said, sipping her tea. "I just wanted to read my book." Jonathan smiled. "Too late, I think." They sat quietly. Then he added, "You know, I had my assistant call the City Arts Commission this morning." Margaret arched a brow. "What for?" He looked at her. "I think it's time the author got her own public reading room. A real one. Not just in the building she owns through me, but one that bears her full name." Margaret laughed, a dry, warm sound. "Jonathan, I don't need that." "I know," he said. "But they do." By the following week, the story had slipped beyond the polished doors of the Crestwick Library and into the bloodstream of the city. It started with a whisper. A grainy cell phone video from the reading. Margaret's voice, steady and bare, reciting a passage about a woman who washed dishes in a gas station at night and dreamt of oceans she'd never see. The post was titled, "Turns out the lady they laughed at wrote our favorite book." 24 hours later, it had 1.2 million views. And then came the ripple. Articles. Tweets. Margaret Hale, trending beside authors with 7-figure advances. Think pieces? Podcasts. Even a morning segment on national television that called her the reclusive voice of the common soul. Her photo, a still from someone's phone, mid-sentence at the lectern, was everywhere. The gray in her hair, the calm in her eyes. The coat she'd once been laughed out of had become a symbol. But Margaret? She was at her kitchen table, eating toast. The fame embarrassed her. She answered a few calls, declined others. Signed a deal to re-release her books under her real name, but only after Jonathan promised full creative control. She didn't want her stories to be turned into shiny things people wore for clout. She wanted them read slowly, in silence, with dog-eared pages and teacups beside them. At the Crestwick Plaza, changes happened fast. The members only sign vanished. The archives were opened by appointment to the public, students especially. The staff underwent training, though some didn't return. Devon stayed. One afternoon, he left a note on Margaret's reading desk. "I was wrong. And I'm listening now. Thank you for your words. I needed them, even when I didn't deserve them. Devon." She never replied. But she left a copy of The Garden of Bare Things on his desk the next day. Page 214 dog-eared. The chapter about learning to see clearly. Meanwhile, Jonathan had been working behind the scenes. At a press event the following month, he stood before a small crowd in front of the city's oldest public library, a modest, aging building on the edge of the arts district. A new plaque gleamed in the sunlight. The Margaret Hale Public Reading Room. In honor of the voices too long ignored. He didn't speak for long. He didn't need to. Margaret watched from the back, arms folded, her son catching her eye mid-speech with a soft smile. And in the crowd, unnoticed by many but unmistakable to her, stood faces from that first morning. Evelyn in her scarf. Callie the intern. Even Ron from the fireplace, holding a copy of A Grace of Light, pages swollen with use. They had come not to be seen, but to witness. And Margaret let them. It had been nearly 2 months since the morning Margaret Hale walked into Crestwick Library in the wrong clothes. Now, she walked into the world with ease, not because it had changed, but because she had stopped waiting for its permission. Her days were quieter than people expected. No book tours. No streaming deals. No mansion in the hills. She lived in the same 2-bedroom apartment above the flower shop where the window panes rattled in the wind and the teapot whistled like an old friend. But her mailbox. That was another story. Each morning brought a fresh pile of envelopes, some handwritten in looping cursive, others typed and stamped with fragile hope. Letters from teachers. Prisoners. Teenagers in foster care. Single fathers. People who had read her stories and, for the first time, felt understood. She kept every single one in a drawer beneath her writing desk. She didn't respond to all of them. How could she? But she read each one, slowly, like scripture. Some she folded and tucked into her coat pocket to carry through the day like prayers. One morning, she pulled a letter from the stack with no return address. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Inside, one sentence. You reminded me that being unseen is not the same as being unworthy. No name. No signature. Just that. She placed it in the drawer on top. That afternoon, she returned to Crestwick. Not for an event. Not for press. Just because the reading room, her reading room, had become a place where the city's invisible could rest. There was a man there today. Middle-aged, calloused hands, a janitor's badge clipped to his worn shirt. He sat with a paperback in hand, staring at the same page for a long time. When he noticed her, he stood quickly. Sorry, didn't realize this room was for. It is, she said gently. It's for you. He blinked. Even if I got dirt on the carpet? Especially then. He smiled, eyes shining, and sat back down slowly. Margaret didn't take a seat. She just watched for a moment, then left the room, her heart heavier and lighter all at once. Outside, she saw Jonathan pacing by a row of benches, phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call and turned to her. They want to name a fellowship after you. Full scholarship for first-gen writers. Nationwide. She blinked. Do they need a speech? They'd like one. She looked down at her hands. Then they're asking the wrong writer. Jonathan frowned. Why? Because I'm not the story, she said quietly. The ones who walk in with nothing and leave with a book in their hands, that's the story. Let them speak. Spring had come softly to the city, its warmth threading through concrete and steel like forgiveness. The benches outside the Margaret Hale reading room were blooming with color, students reading aloud, an elderly woman sketching strangers into notebooks, a man in a city uniform asleep beneath a copy of A Grace of Light curled against his chest. Inside it was quiet. Always quiet. Margaret sat alone at the wide oak table where she'd once felt like a trespasser. A breeze floated through the open window, carrying the scent of rain-damp stone and blooming trees. Her hands rested on a manuscript, her first under her real name. Not a novel this time, but essays. Observations. Moments. 10 mornings I was invisible. 12 afternoons I wasn't. The final page was blank. She left it that way. A knock at the door. Then Callie, the former intern, now a full-time staffer with ink-stained fingers and courage growing daily. Mrs. Hale? There's someone who wants to meet you. I told her you don't really do. It's all right, Margaret said. Let her in. The door opened, and in stepped a girl. Maybe 14. Jeans frayed at the cuffs. Jacket too thin for the season. She held a copy of The Garden of Bare Things like it was something sacred. Margaret stood slowly. You're the first today. The girl nodded nervously. They said I could come. I read all your books. I didn't know you were real. I thought maybe. I just needed to see. Margaret smiled softly. What did you want to see? That someone like me could write things like that. Margaret reached into the side drawer of the desk and pulled out a pen, an old one. The kind with real weight. She held it out. Then I suppose you'd better start. The girl stared at it, speechless. And then, with trembling fingers, she took it. That evening, Margaret walked home slowly, tote bag over her shoulder, the sky the color of apricots and forgiveness. She passed the florist who gave her leftover lilies on Wednesdays. The bookstore with the cracked windows still displaying her paperbacks, now stamped author-signed inside. At her apartment, she placed her coat on its hook and set the kettle on. She moved without ceremony, without rush. She was not famous. She was read. She was not envied. She was understood. And in libraries now, quiet ones, grand ones, corners of coffee shops and middle school shelves, Margaret Hale's name sat shelved beside the very stories that once kept her company through lonely nights. Not a writer the world welcomed, but one it had finally seen. And somewhere in the city, a girl with a pen sat by a window, starting her first story.